I've found that for many projects, especially writing, starting is usually the hardest part. Some of this struggle comes from a desire to get off on the right foot. First impressions count for a lot, and even if a story has great material later on, a reader can easily lose interest if that initial hook isn't strong enough. That concern applies to this video too, the one about beginnings of all things, largely because I think it's going to be the most different from the others when all is said and done. This is going to take more explanation than usual, but just bear with me and we'll get through it. It won't hurt, I promise. So for starters, I'm not covering just one Fangan today, but three. Penguinronpa by Tofudemaru, Danganronpa Another Despair Academy by Linuj, and Ronpa and Friends by EmpireSpade. Why is this? Well, there's lots of ways to get someone invested in a story, and in the same way the Danganronpa series has different methods of starting things off, so too do these Fangans. Each has their own strengths and unique elements, which gives each their own flavor. Thus, I don't think covering just one would suffice for exploring how one can write a good introduction. I also won't be doing my usual method of breaking down a chapter and summarizing it beat by beat. Not every part of the prologues and first chapters in these Fangans fit into what I'm trying to do, that is, focus on the highlights. I feel like it's a bit of je ne sais quoi, so think of it like this. I'm looking more at how these introductions work as introductions, that is, how a writer can bait that hook to get a reader invested instead of how they flow into the next part of the story. For example, I'll be focusing less on daily life since the specifics of an investigation aren't as important to my analysis. As a result, this video is probably going to come across a lot more scattershot, and now it's time we got on with the plot. The first major thing any Danganronpa story does, implications of amnesia aside, is introduce its characters. I feel like a lot of Fangans speed through these to get to the deeper interactions and murders, but it's hard to get invested in unestablished characters. A crossover Fangan like Penguinronpa might be able to get away with this if the cast is already known to the audience, but fleshing them out a bit can go a long way towards immersion. And that's just what introductions are for. Some Fangans have the protagonist beating the cast all at once, other times they'll meet them in groups. Neither's better or worse. That said, the latter does allow a natural way to introduce everyone while exploring the setting at the same time. When it comes to introductions, one pet peeve I have is when the characters say, "Hi, my name is such and such, I'm the ultimate whatever." It sounds unnatural, especially when the main series outside of V3 doesn't introduce its characters like this. Rewatch the character intros for Trigger Happy Havoc. You'll find not one of them says their talent before their intro card. A couple of characters in Danganronpa 2 say their talents by name, but they're the exception. You can even draw inferences about each character based on their intro lines. Each line of dialogue a character gets is a chance to show more of what they're like, reinforce their existing traits, or move the plot forward, and introductions are no exception. In fact, they're a great opportunity to sprinkle in little details for the protagonist and viewer to pick up on. For example, DRA1 has Yuki and Akane get off to an awkward start when he brings up maid cafes. While they quickly make up, we learn Akane takes a lot of pride in her work. Yuki then thinks to himself that Akane can get kinda scary when she's angry despite her friendly appearance. Haruhiko's introduction stands out for showing just how on another level Ultimates are in Danganronpa's setting. He's been flying planes since he was 5, and despite having no formal pilot training, he's been given the title of Ultimate Pilot, even being trusted to take on various test flights. Yuki reflects on all his fellow students to flesh them out more, similar to Makoto in Trigger Happy Havoc. Pivoting to Ronpa and Friends, its intros stick out for how they establish the pre-existing relationships of the cast. As someone who didn't grow up with most Disney cartoons, it's much appreciated, especially for the lesser-known members. For example, we learn that Panchito, Jose, and Donald were in a band together called the Three Caballeros, and so share a tight bond. We also get a large focus on Pete and his past of being a bully to Mickey, but he's since worked on improving himself and is ready to start fresh. It's a very tender moment, especially this early, which makes it all the more tragic when he becomes the first casualty. Speaking of, sneaking in bits of foreshadowing that only become apparent on a second read-through are common in the main games, so feel free to experiment with that. Penguinronpa does this with Rockhopper's intro. There, Paige shows concern over his Puffle and first mate Yar, and the safety of Puffles becomes her main motive for murdering the pirate in Chapter 2. She even says she chose Rockhopper because she figured he wouldn't mind laying down his life for Yar. My main point is that you've only got so much time to introduce your characters, especially since, as they're in a Danganronpa story, some of them won't be around for very long. Mitsuhiro's introduction in DRA1 sets him up well for the short arc he has. We get to see that he's a hotshot celebrity with a bit of arrogance, but he's not above an occasional goof-up, like this line where he says he was second to last to arrive. Even if the player doesn't see a single one of his free time events, they learn all they need to know about him for a first glance. A prologue also has to establish the killing game's concept convincingly. Naturally, there will be lines about the characters looking around, trying to find escape routes and such, only for there to be none. While one could see it as a nuisance to just get through before the story can actually begin, it's another chance to characterize. How do the characters react to waking up in a confined environment? Do they have any strange out there solutions or theories? It's also a great time to explore the setting more and create expectations for it. DRA1 has the students under the belief they're in Hope's Peak Academy, and the initial setting sticks pretty closely to that before later chapters break away from it, with the divergence becoming more obvious. Penguinronpa takes an interesting approach in my opinion. It uses a familiar location in Club Penguin Island, but makes small tweaks that allow the killing game to happen while building up the mystery. There's force fields blocking access to most of the island, several buildings are locked, and Monopert replaces the clock tower with a PA system. There's also the occasional item left in an odd spot, like a blueprint Agent and Klutzy find in Chapter 1. It's both a reference to an in-game location and more teasing for the characters having amnesia. I also tend to like when fangans include locations in the setting beyond the bare essentials. Examples include the antique store in DRA1 and the gift shop in Penguinronpa. They can help make wherever the killing game is taking place feel more well-rounded, and be an explanation for where items involved in the murders come from. Next comes the inciting incident, where Monokuma, or the mascot character, shows up to explain how the killing game will work. Interestingly, not all fangans will tell the characters what the consequences of the trials are. In fact, Penguinronpa doesn't even mention the trials until after the first murder happens. It's easy to think that a writer knowing everything about how the game works means everything will just be explained right away, but Danganronpa 1 pulled this trick too. Whether or not the trials and executions are explained right away is something every fangan will need to consider. Not having the info be revealed right away allows for more believability with the first killer, since they'll have done the deed not realizing they're dooming everyone else if they pass the trial. However, this also kicks the can of the first motive needing to be something hard-hitting, something to force the game into motion, down the road to the second one. In that case, it's the second killer who will be the first to devise a murder plot while knowing the stakes. Thus, the second motive needs to be on a similar level to the first in order to make someone knowingly take that risk. There is still debatably some leeway with the first motive, even if trials and executions are public knowledge, though not as much. The characters won't know just how brutal the executions are until they see one, after all. Backing up a bit, the last thing this part of the prologue needs to do is have the mascot make a show of force to show why the cast can't fight back right away. If the characters just accept their circumstances, then any threats the mascot makes can ring hollow to the audience, since they haven't been pushed yet. It also doesn't make sense for the cast not to at least try. Sure, they're trapped, but they're not aware of what their captor is capable of. It's even a chance for some great characterization, as DRA1 demonstrates. As soon as Monokuma explains everything, Tsurugi is on his case, listing the crimes he's committed before the killing game even starts. All fitting for an ultimate police officer, and then we see how deep his hatred for criminals is, as he slams him into the wall, demanding everyone be released. Seeing someone with Tsurugi's drive be forced to stand down just when he's getting riled up is a great way of showing how dire the situation is. Mikako also gets established as the silent, mysterious character with a sense for danger, as she shouts a warning to Tsurugi to jump out of the line of fire. Penguinronpa does the show of force well too, but turns it a little. Rather than retaliate against the first person to attack him, Monobert blows up the clock tower simply for everyone refusing to call him Monobert, and replaces it with his PA system. On top of getting his point across, it also characterizes Monobert in an interesting way. Monokuma and most mascots like him usually just let their captives do whatever within the rules, with the occasional comic relief. Monobert is similar, but moments like this show he's willing to get more aggressive with the characters. It makes sense. Several of them knew Herbert before Penguinronpa, and this act is on par with several of his schemes in terms of destruction, but it's much less prompted. The fact he did it so easily compared to other plans of his, coupled with what he's shown to be capable of, later indicates just how dangerous he is. It also demonstrates that while he's somewhat fair-minded in terms of running the killing game, Monobert will still jump at the opportunity to kick down at anyone he has a vendetta against, however small the reason. The prologue is also an ideal place to introduce additional twists to the killing game formula. Penguinronpa has this on full display, as Klutzy is noticeably different from everyone else in the cast, both in terms of what he is and how he's introduced. Up to this point, we've only seen 14 penguins. Even the note directing them to that first meeting with Monobert only lists their names. Then, after introducing himself, Monobert brings in Klutzy as the 15th participant. Revealing Klutzy in this way raises a lot of questions. Why is he here? Since he's Herbert's sidekick, is he on Monobert's side? Why does Monobert not seem to care about him in any way? Right away, it's an interesting take on the all-knowing silent character. Klutzy has been known to be an enemy, if a comedic one, to much of the cast, and his inability to speak or even communicate via writing, as we see later, makes it hard for him to get his intentions across, much less tell anyone what's really going on. Combined with his relative frailty, it soon sets in that almost all eyes will be on him, whether as a potential murder victim or a suspect should one happen. If you're planning on breaking from the formula, having that break happen in the prologue can be a way to get your audience thinking about twists to come, which is one of the best places to have them in. When a reader's imagination is able to run wild about what could happen next, that's a sign of a good narrative hook. If you've seen my previous videos, you may recall me citing Tofudemaru as saying daily life is just as important as deadly life. Daily life is what sets up all the killings to come, and allows for changes in the status quo without the need for any characters dying. Within the context of a Danganronpa story, it's an ideal place to move all the pieces, big and small, into place for the next big shift to happen. For Chapter 1, we're still in early days, so setting up the relationships characters will have in the short and long term is crucial. Not all of them need to be in the spotlight, but the bulk of the longer-lasting ones should have their origins made apparent here on a rewatch. For example, this scene in Danganronpa Another 1 is, at first glance, a way of setting up an important incident in the first trial. It's also the most focus Kyoka gets in any one scene before her death soon after, a way to set up some hope of avoiding any murders before it comes crashing down. For the long term though, it's the start of the relationship between Haruhiko and Satsuki. From how they talk here and during the chapter's trial, it's clear they're not close friends yet, but this scene has done something to break the ice between them, and we'll see them interacting more moving forward. There's also several smaller moments showing the roles everyone fills in the group dynamic. After the motive is announced, there's naturally some unease. Characters like Rei, Mitsuhiro, and Kizuna all feel a sense of distrust creeping in. They're stuck with a bunch of strangers who they've only met 3 days ago with no obvious means of escape, and now everyone has a reason beyond regaining their freedom to kill. Meanwhile, characters like Kyoka, Akane, Tsurugi, and Kanada try to keep the peace and ensure the group is still united. While all these reactions may come off as throwaway lines in the moment, the side each character takes here generally lines up with how they interact with the rest of the group in later chapters. Generally, any character not slated to be a survivor will get more focus in the chapter where they die. Balancing screen time is important so their deaths don't feel too telegraphed, but I'd rather see too much than too little. For example, had Mikako been DRA1's first victim with no other changes, it would have cut her short with little exploration of her personality, as most of that and her ties to the greater narrative don't become apparent until much later. As for DRA1's actual first victim, Kyoka doesn't have quite as much screen presence as you'd want a first victim to have. It may be surprising when she's the first to go, but aside from the scenes I've mentioned and a few lines showing her to be one of the more outspoken students, she doesn't have much to go on. Her last scene is the most focus she gets, and I wouldn't blame anyone for seeing it as a red flag for her death. Granted, there are callbacks to her at later parts in the story, quite a few in fact, but in the moment she can come off as an underwhelming, obvious first death for those who crave unpredictability. On the other side, we have Mitsuhiro, who I think is built up fairly well. As I said before, we get a basic idea of his character in the prologue, which is then built on in Chapter 1. At the first group meeting, he compares their location to that of a luxury hotel. While he doesn't say he's fine just staying put, one could interpret this in a few different ways. To some, it could be fame getting to his head even as he's being kidnapped, and to others it could come across as him being less concerned about the situation at hand. In a later scene, he's about to force himself onto Akane, reinforcing the scumbag celebrity trope he's based on. I find this scene working better than Kyoka's big scene in daily life because Mitsuhiro isn't the only focus. We get to hear Akane's thoughts on him after he leaves, and she also gets some backstory as she explains she's had to deal with similar advances in her line of work. This brings her and Yuki together for the first time, and leads directly into them checking out the antique store. There, they build up the start of a bond as they each remind the other of longtime friends, and Akane says she sees Yuki as one of the most trustworthy of the group. Then we get Akane's first free time event, where she explains the gist of her backstory backstory and why she became a maid in the first place. Last up is Tsurugi. He gets less coverage than the others since he doesn't have a scene alone with Yuki in daily life, but he comes across as a competent, capable leader who's prepared to guide everyone to safety. From the word go, he's organizing everyone into regular group meetings, getting them to investigate, and smoothing out conflict whenever it arises. Satsuki even starts calling him the ultimate leader for how forward he's being with keeping the group focused on escape. Penguinronpa's first chapter being shorter than its counterparts means it doesn't have as much time to establish itself, but it does get some important parts across. The most obvious is its red herring with Rookie confiding about his fears to Agent. It may come across as trying too hard when almost everyone else hasn't had anything equivalent to this, but I think it's a decent way to demonstrate their relationship. It's also got some value in the long run, too, as Rookie will later describe their bond like that of siblings, and the EPF agents will later remark on their family-like dynamic. It serves a purpose in showing the dynamic early on, before it's explained in full. Aunt Arctic also gets a lot of focus during Chapter 1, as first victims should. Tofudemaru said in their 2021 Q&A that she was chosen to die first because of how great a leader she would be, even being a good protagonist candidate. While Chapter 1 is pretty thin compared to what comes after, we get to see the reporter stepping into her natural leader role. She's the one to gather all the penguins at the beginning of the prologue and is always supportive and understanding of the viewpoints of others. Examples include allowing Agent to not reveal their name during introductions and listening to Rookie's jokes. This makes it all the more heartbreaking when, despite her attempts to keep everyone united, the first motive results in the group splitting apart. It only gets worse when she heads out alone in the dead of night to try and talk to Monobird, which is what gets her killed. Post-mortem, the characters talk about how she was basically the leader of Club Penguin Island, and we get to see the impact her death leaves behind in Chapter 2, with the remaining EPF agents having trouble deciding how to proceed. Chapter 1's last major character focus is Klutzy, who, as we've already seen, is in an unusual position. Since everyone else sees him as untrustworthy, he's left with the two least serious EPF agents in Rookie and, well, Agent, which allows him to start making some inroads with the group. Despite the language barrier, his actions speak louder than words, and Agent sees that his intentions are genuine after he leads them to a clue late into daily life. It's this interaction which leads Agent to decide Klutzy can be trusted, so much so they even offer to let him sleep in their igloo. It's the start of a beautiful, unlikely friendship thanks to them both being found in unusual circumstances. I feel like some might see it as easy to force, but Tofu going to these lengths to show how that initial trust was established ensures it's not. It also shows Agent's desire to do the right thing, and for Klutzy, that means defending him from any unwarranted accusations and giving him a shoulder to lean on when no one else will. Ronpa and Friends has a pretty darn strong start for an Insta-Ronpa of the time. Just about every character in the cast gets some focus beyond their introduction to ensure the viewer understands what they're all about. It's honestly pretty impressive, doubly so considering I didn't have much familiarity with this cast, both the well-known and the obscure. There's some easily understood stuff like Mickey and Minnie's loving relationship, Fenton seeing his civilian persona as useless, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the many teases of Darkwing and Launchpad. One of the big standout arcs during the chapter is that of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Upon first introduction, he's one of the more abrasive characters, specifically towards Mickey. Oswald thinks his friendly, outgoing personality is all a facade to cover for him being the one behind the killing game. After a night out drinking with the boys, Mickey gets a hangover, so Oswald helps him to his room and looks after him till the next morning. When it becomes clear Mickey really knows nothing about Oswald and what his deal is, he starts to soften up, realizing Mickey isn't to blame for whatever has him so annoyed. After this, we see more positive moments from Oswald. For example, he's quick to shut down Fenton's idea to sacrifice himself for the good of the group after the first motive is announced. The other main standout during daily life is Pete. I already touched on his introduction and his promise to change, and by all accounts, he seems to have done just that. He makes a show of force to ensure Mortimer stays quiet about Fenton being Gizmo Duck's secret identity, is always acting supportive towards Mickey whenever he's around, and Goofy goes into some detail about how he got Pete the help he needed after he hit rock bottom and got kicked out of his own house. He's brought up alongside Mortimer as a good example of even the roughest members of the group getting along with everyone, though he's portrayed in a more positive light than the latter. Moving back a bit, the scene between Goofy and Mickey where they talk about Pete is one of the chapter's best in my opinion. It provides some great interactions between the two as Goofy relapses on his old smoking habit and thinks about his history with it. He also has a surprisingly profound moment when he thinks about where his son Max might be and makes Mickey promise to take care of him if he doesn't come out of this alive. On top of this being foreshadowing for him being the first killer, just hearing this come from one of the most comedic, lighthearted, kindest characters in the cast shows how serious the situation is. With a lot of stories, the comic relief leaning too hard on the humorous side and breaking up any tension there might have been is a very real pitfall that ought to be avoided, and I think EmpireSpade nailed that balance here. Goofy isn't the kind of person to get depressed easily, but the fact he's willing to have a heart-to-heart like this gives him a great deal more depth. On a similar level to how much Penguinronpa was able to set up about its mysteries in its tightly paced second chapter, Ronpa and Friends does the same with its characters here. There's so much I haven't even touched on for the sake of time that I may have to give this chapter a full-blown analysis of its own. Since I've already gone in-depth about how the reveals of the first motive, trial system, and consequences can be handled, let's move right along into Deadly Life. Like with other norms of a Danganronpa-style story, it's important not to skimp on explanations for things like the usual autopsy reports and the itinerary for how investigations and trials will work. We know how these things work. The characters, unless the story is a sequel featuring characters familiar with the Killing Game's concepts, do not. DRA1 even gets some extra characterization out of it. Akane's shocked reaction is contrasted with Tsurugi basically treating it as another day on the job, and the latter immediately blames himself for Kyoka dying on his watch before calling on everyone to get to the bottom of her death. After Monokuma hands out the files, Rei reveals herself and says she was eavesdropping until she was certain the bear wasn't just trying to trick everyone. It's a small moment, but it serves a dual purpose of showing Rei's more analytical, logical approach to everything, as well as her being a suspect for the upcoming trial who several people distrust. The investigations are also a new way to explore the characters. As one would expect, Tsurugi and Rei are seen as the smartest of the group, but differ in that one is highly cooperative while the other goes it alone. Rei will sometimes provide an explanation for some oddities about the crime, but only after someone else points it out. She's never the one to help move things forward, and rarely misses an opportunity to deride everyone else. She will occasionally provide some assistance, like when she points Yuki towards Kakeru for her alibi, but she does it in a very passive-aggressive, roundabout way that dumps the legwork on whoever approaches her. Another character who gets to shine here is Kanata. While she's more of a side character, the investigations and her bringing up actual information about topics like rigor mortis and the speed at which blood coagulates reinforce her status as the ultimate surgeon. She's still distraught at Kyoka's death, of course, but as a surgeon, heading into a high-pressure scenario where her skill set is needed isn't too unusual for her, circumstances aside. Now, not every character will be helpful during an investigation beyond just being in the right place at the right time, but not all of them have to be. Teruya is a good example of this. At first he struggles to take any action given the whiplash of the Killing Game becoming a reality, but after Yuki calms him down, his interest in the antique store helps confirm the source of the killer's tools they used in their murder plan later on. It's a small niche that might have gone unnoticed were he not the ultimate merchant, and there's a few other strokes of helpfulness throughout this chapter and the rest of the game. Looking back on Teruya's overall arc of falling more and more into realist tendencies as the story goes on, his early reactions and seemingly innocuous lines make this part of his personality quite clear. The main difference between Chapter 1 and, say, Chapter 4 is that he specifically hasn't been pushed to a breaking point. As for Ronpa and Friends, the investigation is on the shorter side, but some important dynamics are given more attention here. Chief among them is Chip, often breaking away from the rest of the group with Dale to investigate alone, and keeping up his hard-boiled detective persona. He berates Mickey for missing a surefire chance of catching the killer in the act, and his behavior leaves Dale caught between supporting his brother and getting along with the group. Other dynamics include Mortimer never passing up a chance to throw insults or accusations at the three Caballeros, Donald getting riled up every time he does this, Darkwing's serious, matter-of-fact approach to the case, and everyone bringing in the weapons Monobulb gifted them to see if any could be caught out by just having the murder weapon. It also allows the investigation to end on a cliffhanger when Panchito and Goofy both have the exact same knife as their weapon, with Monobulb declaring the investigation over right after. Given the general trend of this video has been to take every opportunity possible to give characters more character, or build on existing traits, it's natural I'd even talk about the pre-trial portraits. It's just another way of getting a character's overall vibe just from looking at an image of them. Instead of just standing neutrally, Rei has her arms folded and looks as confident as she does smug. The usually timid, shy Kakeru has a wide grin on his face, ready to bring out his powerful courtroom persona. Meanwhile, others like Teruya and Akane are visibly nervous, sweating at the thought of what's about to happen. Chip and Dale share a portrait, indicating their bond of brotherhood. Fenton's portrait is split, being one half Gizmo Duck and one half himself, showing showing his two different personas and the contrast between them. These portraits aren't a necessary staple, but I'd implore any artist to have some fun with them and try to capture the essence of the characters, dead or alive. After covering all this ground, the last major place for characters and their dynamics to be explored is the trial and its aftermath. Many breakout character moments happen here in the main series, like Kyoko stepping up as the main crime solver of the group, and Nagito revealing his true nature. As it's the first trial, character arcs and any patterns a writer wants to include that haven't been brought up yet should have their tone firmly set here, no further. There might be greater development of the ideas a writer wants to pursue later on, but the first trial is essentially the last opportunity to embed them in the story as a consistent presence, to plant the seeds, so to speak. For example, if Tsurugi maintained his personality of an ideal leader whose only flaw is being a little too hard on himself for all of Chapter 1, only to have his mask-off moment in Chapter 2, it would make the first part of his arc feel overly stretched out. Now, characters don't necessarily have to have their roles in a trial come across as consistent or obvious. Take Klutzy, for example. He's an early suspect in the first case, but for each case afterward, his vulnerability and potential to be a murder victim is emphasized more and more. At the same time, once it's clear he's not in much position to cut anyone's throat and some of the cast trust him more, he's able to make contributions of his own. Meanwhile, there are characters like Haruhiko and Satsuki in DRA1 who don't contribute much to figuring out the case, but interactions in a first trial like theirs can be another hint that them being together for the earlier scene with Kyoko wasn't a one-off. They've got a little bit of chemistry, but the reaction hasn't gone off just yet. I've said a few times so far that the first chapter should set the tone for what's to come. For the trials, the first one presents the chance for overall themes and longer-lasting arcs to be made apparent. However, even if any through line connecting them all together is loose, having the first trial set things where they need to be for later events to happen can pick up the slack. Penguinronpa is a solid example of this. The first trial is definitely the weakest, and while what comes after is pretty good, the most I can really say connects all of them is everyone wanting to do good, but the lengths they're willing to go to result in tragedy. The real strength of Penguinronpa's first case isn't in the case itself or any themes, it's in the narrative. Antarctic is presented as the leader of the island, the glue, always encouraging everyone and trying to keep the peace. It takes Monobird's first motive for anything to even begin going awry, and the void her death leaves behind becomes clear the further the story goes on. Had she not been killed and Sensei not been executed, Rookie might have found his confidence sooner. Paige could have been reined in before she went rogue. Dot may not have felt the need to hide her emotions, and so on. Another key area it succeeds in is making the tragedy of the killer and victim as equal as possible. This is easier for the killers, since they get an entire trial's worth of content and can explain themselves after the fact. Outside of flashbacks, we don't usually get that for the victims, which can make writing them a challenge. It's sad to see their lives get cut short, but there needs to be more than that. Now for Ronpa and friends, I don't think the connection between all the cases is a theme per se, and more a common through line. The way I see it, the story is about these characters being turned against themselves and each other, largely by using their relationships against themselves to cause strife. As for how this theme ties into the first trial, the motive was the classic threatening of loved ones, with the added twist that if a murder happened, the hostages would be released, though those within the killing game, like Mickey and Minnie, would remain trapped. While everyone received their own video, Pete's and Goofy's were swapped. With the two being neighbors, they were already looking out for each other. Pete even asked Goofy to look out for his family if anything happens to him on the first day of the killing game, which inspired Goofy to say the same to Mickey. The murder was effectively an assisted suicide. Pete tried to shoot himself, but survived. Goofy found him and finished him off at his request so he could escape and ensure the safety of Pete's family and Max. It's a solid emotional anchor, made stronger by neither knowing of the trial system and its consequences. The other major beat the first trial gets across is establishing Chip as the main rival of the group, even more so than the ultimate rival himself. He's an interesting case. He starts out very cold and logical, yet in every trial after the first, he's often depicted as being wrong. This is most obvious in the Scrum debates, where he opposes the protagonist every chance he gets. Here, though, he accuses Mickey of trying to get everyone killed by hiding information in order to protect someone. Though he does realize Mickey didn't fully understand the importance of some clues, he still chafes against the group rather than trying to meet in the middle. He disregards any emotional ties people might have with each other, and as much as Mickey wants to retaliate, he ends up being right. He rattles off a laundry list of evidence implicating Goofy as the killer, even pointing out how unusually quiet the latter has been during the trial. Chip then takes Mickey to task for trying to play the hero, quote-unquote, similar to how Oswald did so before and Mortimer would go on to do later. Speaking of Oswald, he's taken aback by how callous Chip is acting. It's a sharp contrast from how cold he was acting towards Mickey at the beginning. The argument reignites right after everyone leaves the courtroom and makes it clear where things stand. Chip isn't budging on his views, even shooting down Dale's attempt at saying he didn't mean it. Dale's then left with the tough choice of having to support his brother or work with the group he's chosen to split off from. Meanwhile, Oswald and the others are at best unsure of what to think of Chip, and at worst are going to see him as difficult to work with. As for DRA1, its case is also fairly simple, but it spends time on interesting ideas. While Ray keeps berating people for relying on Tsurugi so much, the latter seems aware of how difficult the situation is for everyone. To that end, he helps lead the discussion, but makes an effort to have the rest of the students figure out the case on their own. He will sometimes bring up a point of his own, but this is only after someone, usually Yuki, makes a breakthrough. When Mitsuhiro starts being cornered as the killer, one of the more amusing moments is when his appearances on TV are used as proof for his ability to control and aim a ball. Not only is it another showcase of the skill level of an ultimate and of Mitsuhiro's celebrity status, it's also a nice irony to see the fame he craves so much playing a role in his downfall. Now as for what DRA1's overarching theme is, it's stated to be process and result, or in other words, whether or not the ends justify the means. Those words aren't outright mentioned in Chapter 1, but the idea is there. The killing game as a concept lays it out plainly for every character involved, what it would take for them to kill in order to escape, and what other lengths they're willing to go to in order to achieve their goals. DRA1's first trial is where this theme starts to be explored. After Mitsuhiro is executed, everyone is shaken at seeing one of their new friends die in such a brutal manner. That is, except for Tsurugi, who finds the idea of calling a killer a friend confusing. It's here that his true nature is revealed, with new sprites to match. As it turns out, Tsurugi agrees with Monokuma's eye for an eye, death for a death outlook, even saying it's his motto. For him, Mitsuhiro was his friend before murdering Kyoka, and got what he deserved. He doesn't even consider criminals to be human beings. Another trick DRA1 does well is having its killer be the ideal first killer for the story it's trying to tell. Most stories like this will have the killer be morally gray to stir up the conflicting emotions of the killing game. Not so with Mitsuhiro. From the conversations everyone has after the verdict, it's clear he was going to murder with or without the motive. It just so happened to be an excuse for him. Aside from the deranged killers usually seen in Danganronpa's third cases, this is about as unsympathetic as one can get, and it's the perfect backdrop to have Tsurugi explain his ideology. Had Mitsuhiro been more sympathetic or even morally gray, Tsurugi's speech wouldn't have hit as hard, and everyone else would likely reject his leadership sooner. But with a killer who clearly knew what he was doing all the way through, there's enough there for him to have a point, enough for most of the group to stick by him, albeit reluctantly. With the first killer axed, it would seem there's little left to wrap up before moving on. However, some fangans will include one last scene of interest before ending Chapter 1, often to set up longer arcs. Like I said before, the first chapter is one of the best places to drop an origin point for those bigger stories and mysteries. I've noticed fangans tend to be more upfront about what's happening in these post-trial scenes compared to the main series, which was often more vague. Not sure if I have a preference, but presenting more information, even if it's incomplete, allows a reader to speculate. They can't really do this with a throwaway line whose meaning only becomes clear on a rewatch. That said, if you're writing a fangan and feel the first chapter has done enough, don't feel like you have to stretch things out. Plenty of great chapters just end with the protagonist thinking about the seemingly hopeless situation before drifting off to sleep. Heck, that's what DRA1 does. The one important bit is Yuki not remembering what his parents look like, an easily forgotten line that does have a payoff, but not until much later. Meanwhile, Penguinronpa and Ronpa and friends opt for more intrigue. The former sees Klutzy eavesdropping on a conversation between Monobert and the traitor, who swears off working with him and asks to be treated like the other participants. Monobert responds with a story about what Antarctic was doing on the night of her murder, and explains that the rules keep him from killing anyone without a good reason. However, the traitor breaking their agreement would suffice. Realizing this, the traitor offers him a deal as the chapter ends. It's a solid way of getting viewers to think about what's going on. Who's this traitor? Why are they working for Monobert? What do they have in common with Antarctic? What would Monobird have shown Antarctic if she hadn't been killed? What deal did the traitor make? They're all appetizing questions, and being prompted to ask them this early on can allow one's imagination to go wild with possibilities. Meanwhile, the aftermath scenes in Ronpa and Friends are a complete tease. Mickey can't sleep and goes on a walk in the middle of the night, soon finding a secret room full of monitors, photos, and pieces of monobulb. Before he can take it all in, the mastermind, identity unknown, apprehends him. There's some light foreshadowing for who they could be, but it builds them up as a huge threat and someone brimming with malice. They ponder how to deal with Mickey before choosing to just let him go but wipe his memory of the event. It can come across as odd at first, but I think its best trait is in showing the mastermind's cruelty. They could have just killed Mickey and framed someone for it, but that would end the killing game too soon. This person wants the characters to suffer as much as possible, and a quick death for a simple intrusion won't accomplish that. Perhaps the most interesting part of the Ronpa and Friends post-trial scenes is the intermissions between chapters following Goofy's son Max and Gadget Hackwrench. They provide a glimpse of what's going on in the outside world. We get to see that the threat of the motive videos was true for everyone involved, and several other Disney characters are embroiled in a conflict erupting on the outside. I don't have much to say about the events of the intermissions, since it seems like they're meant for someone more familiar with the Disney lore, at least for the later ones. They do eventually provide clues one can use to determine who the mastermind is, but the events of the story don't cross over with the killing game. That said, it's a nice change of pace to take a break from the main plot for a bit to answer some other questions a viewer might have, and overall, I just like the concept of playing with the structure. I feel like this video meandered at times, but I hope I got my point across. Simply put, there's lots of ways to start a fangan. There's staying close to the formula as Penguinronpa does, klutzy notwithstanding, to using familiarity to ease viewers in before springing the trap as DRA1 does with Tsurugi. Or you can play fast and loose with the overall structure as Ronpa and Friends does. Whatever approach a fangan takes to getting its hooks into the reader, it needs to get its characters and concept across, and have the killing game's arbiter establish themselves as an actual threat as soon as possible. Past that, characters and the group dynamic should be explored based on their initial reactions to the situation and how they play off one another. The first case doesn't need to be the most interesting or complicated, but it should set up larger themes, through lines, and character arcs to come. But as exploring these three fangans and their varied approaches to introductions has shown, each of these pieces has so many different ways of being explored. It all depends on execution and the kind of story a writer wants to tell, but with enough thought and care, just about anything can get the story started on the right foot. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked what you saw, feel free to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel if you want to know when I release new videos. Also be sure to check out the featured creators and their work. Links to Penguinronpa, Ronpa and Friends, Danganronpa Another, their creators, and any translators for DRA will be in the description. This video took a little longer to finish than I would have liked, but better late than never, as they say. Plus, now I think I've got a good idea of what the next few will look like. My next video may also get experimental, but not as much as this one. Hopefully that means I'll have it out quicker. Whatever happens, I'm really excited for what I've got coming up, and I hope to see you all again soon. Take care, everyone.